Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom slash Stewart Squared series podcast, potentially new podcast. We've got my uncle Joe Alsop and my father Stuart Alsop, and we are going to talk about the rise of the early personal computing industry. And I'll hand it over to my father Stuart Alsop. Well, actually, let's first thank Joe Alsop for coming on, and I'll hand it over to my dad to start it. Let it begin.
So actually, I'll see if I can summarize Joe's career. Joe is somewhat older than I am, more mature, and he graduated MIT and was involved in founding a number of companies. Ultimately, he started a company called Progress Software, which still is a publicly held company. But he graduated MIT, if I can remember, in 1967.
Pretty close. Very good. Right on.
Okay, pretty close. So he has history before the personal computer. And so what's interesting here is Stuart is young enough not to have participated in the personal computer industry, and Joe is old enough to have participated before the personal computer. And so we have kind of three generations, because that's where I started, was with the PC industry. And so we'll start out by saying Joe and I have had Joe founded Progress Software in my house in Boston, Massachusetts, back when I lived there. And we've had a long-term conversation going about the computer industry and, what really matters. And so when the PC industry was starting, I think Joe was kind of like, those are like toys compared to the real computers that I'm used to working with. Is that a fair recollection, Joe?
To be fair to us, we did quickly port our software to the PC.
Huh.
But the P in PC stands for personal, and our focus was more on organizations, and automating, making it easier for them to automate whatever they do. And so the PC was kind of interesting, but probably not at the center of what we were trying to do.
Yeah, and so one of the things I'm known for in the computer industry is having predicted the end of the mainframe. And there are all kinds of people who
A
got
little
pissed.
prematurely, if I recall
A
correctly.
little prematurely. In fact, you could say that possibly it still exists today. At least IBM thinks that, and a few other companies. But my reaction to that is, well, mainframes these days are just networks of personal computers grown up now. And so now we have, mainframes or supercomputers that are really collections of computers that are on the internet. And so anyway, I feel that I was still right. So
I wonder how many billions IBM has made since your prediction off mainframe.
well, the
Anyway,
interesting
let's continue.
IBM put me in an annual report with a picture of me eating my words.
That's right.
Yeah.
So Joe, so you said that it wasn't really your focus to be into PCs, but you were serving these larger institutions. And so what was automation like before the PC? Can you give us an idea of what that looked like?
Sure. So my history with computers goes back to the 60s. I had a evening job programming a 1401, a number which all IBM people will immediately recognize. And then one summer with a roommate, we programmed our uncle's 360 computer. But in all those cases, it was kind of the basic kind of accounting, and probably accounting is a fair statement, that's where computers first found a home inside corporations. Okay, is doing the basic accounting, accounts receivable, accounts payable, the sort of basic financial functions within a corporation. In my case, one of those first projects was setting up a system to keep track of insurance premiums in an insurance company. How much has a customer paid, what do they still owe, and so on and so forth. So it was fairly kind of basic, automating the back office of corporations. It's where computers first got started, and in particular mainframes. And sort of to continue that, the 70s were really the era of the mini computer. Companies that probably are mostly lost to history now. Only
What is
one
it?
still exists, and that's Hewlett Packard, but the others were Digital Equipment, DEC, Data General, Wang Laboratories, and Prime Computer. Those were the 5 big mini computer companies in the 70s.
What is a mini computer?
So mini computers were like a stripped down, the underlying technology wasn't that much different from mainframes. You know, the microchip was really what changed things in the 80s. But they were like mini versions of mainframes that were simpler, cheaper, you know, much more affordable. IBM conveniently liked their monopoly or near monopoly at the high level, kept the prices high, allowed those other 4 or 5 companies to compete at a lower level with simpler, smaller computers that, you know, departmental computing came into vogue as a term back then. So you bought a mini computer for, you know, some department of your company or your organization. And then the big change, of course, which Stuart was very heavily involved in, was the transition to the personal computer.
Yeah, and the IBM PC was introduced in 1981, if I remember
Yeah, I
correctly.
think introduced in 81, shipped in 82.
Yeah, and then that first IBM PC, that took a while for it to take hold, but then it really took hold and took off, particularly when other companies started building IBM compatible computers.
Yeah, and personal computers existed in the 70s because of things like the Apple II and CPM and things like that. So, but it was pretty small, kind of hobbyist oriented. Actually, Stuart, you should tell the story of VisiCalc, because that's what really brought,
Yeah,
and then 123, because those are what brought personal computers kind of into the mainstream of
into the office. Yeah,
into the
yeah,
office.
yeah. So my interaction where I started was with VisiCalc, which was the first spreadsheet developed by 2 guys named Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankston in Boston, and it's how I discovered computers. So actually, I'll tell the whole story, which is I was working at Inc. magazine, and we would do regular polls to see what people were reading, the articles in our magazine. And we'd do articles about like Data General and mini computers. Nobody read them. It was like, we sat there, we go, okay, we're not publishing any more of that computer stuff, because it obviously bores our readers to tears, and we want to write about stuff like starting companies and more interesting stuff. And so then I ran across this company, Software Arts, was the developer of VisiCalc, and it was really fascinating. They could do spreadsheets on an Apple II, and an Apple II at the time had a little screen, green screen, with 40 lines of characters on it, and they'd figured out how to manipulate that screen to turn it into a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet was fun. It was like you could recalculate things, and you could get different results. And someone once referred to it as more like a game than a business program. And so I went and talked to them and started to get, this is fascinating. This is much more interesting than those mini computers. And so that's how I got into it. And I bought an Apple II and set it up on my dining room table, and started using VisiCalc and wrote a series of articles about them in Inc. magazine. That's how I got started in the personal computer industry.
So it's really interesting because I've gone over this several times now. I think probably with you, Dad, a few times, and then I read the Steve Jobs biography, and everybody talks about the spreadsheets. And I hate spreadsheets. At the last company I was working for, they're all using spreadsheets and such. But I imagine that the spreadsheet, what like the computer version of a spreadsheet, was basically the same as a physical version of a spreadsheet. So were both of you using actual physical versions? What did people use before the computer came around?
I never did spreadsheets. The spreadsheets were these big sheets of paper, and you would write numbers in the columns, and if one of them was wrong, you have to kind of erase it and start over again. And it's like so the spreadsheets were the domain of a very specialized group of people that knew that. I don't know if Joe Joe is financially
And
savvy.
so I have the pleasure and the fun of actually working with Dan Bricklin, one of the inventors of VisiCalc. And he describes sitting in a class at Harvard Business School, and the professor would go and write some numbers on the board and then change the assumptions. And so, just erase the numbers on the board and manually recalculate it. And as he was sitting in a particular chair, which now has a label on the back of the chair saying this is where the spreadsheet was first conceptualized, he thought to himself, gee, it ought to be possible for a computer, if you change an assumption or change a number or whatever, to just recalculate everything automatically and instantly, rather than eraser or, either wiping it out on the board or erasing on a piece of paper and then recalculating all the numbers, probably making mistakes and so forth. So that was the original genius that created the spreadsheet.
And when people saw it on an Apple II was like a home computer, personal computer. It was really known more as a maybe games, maybe other stuff, but this is like accountants, people in finance departments saw this and went, "Oh wow, I can do that!" And so they went out and bought Apple IIs, and this was referred to by a pundit then as the tail that wagged the Apple dog. That people were
Exactly.
buying Apple IIs in order to run VisiCalc, and it was a true phenomena. What's happened in the last 40 years is it's gone up, it's gone through multiple generations of different spreadsheets, and even Microsoft Excel now, people are looking at it and going, this is really pretty old way of doing stuff. There's probably better ways to do this.
And that's how,
Anyway,
that's
so
how, yeah, that's how most SaaS companies really seemed like they start out as just like they start out in a spreadsheet doing something, and then they figure out how to actually do that thing in a much better way with a better user interface. But well, actually, wait, that could be a good question. When did databases come into the picture? Were databases always an important part?
great question for Joe, since he
Yeah.
was one of the originators.
So the databases inherently are involved with making information accessible to an organization, not to an. To go back to your original question of how much attention we paid to the IBM PC, we never really saw it as our market, except to the extent that the PC might be the way you get at the data, right, on a network. Access to a central database. So from early on, the whole issue of, well, how do you organize the information on the computer? How do you make it so it's easy to get at, easy to update, doesn't get corrupted, doesn't get messed up? And there was this thing called batch processing, which was associated with mainframes. No human being touched the data. It was punched into cards. The cards were loaded into a tray, run through a card reader, and then these files on a big mainframe would get updated, and then the next day you'd repeat. Okay, so there was no idea of a human being actually touching the data and doing something with it. It was all through the intermediary of filling out forms. The forms would get key punched into cards. The cards would get loaded, read by the computer, and then the information would be updated. There was kind of this daily cycle of accounting or billing or accounts receivable or factory automation or whatever the heck it was. Everything was tied to a kind of a 24-hour cycle. The personal computer turned that on its head. There were some things that happened before that. A lot of the mini computers came with terminals. Eventually, mainframes came with terminals as well, so you could actually interact directly with the data, but it was pretty crude. But it's really the need to deal with a whole organization, right, rather than an individual and his spreadsheets or his documents, that drove the development of databases. Particularly in the 70s and into the 80s. That's when the database business really started, in the 70s.
Interesting. And was Progress Software also a database company? Did you guys build databases? What is Progress?
Let me see if I can explain that, and then Joe will tell me how I'm wrong. But yes, it was a database company, but the thing that Progress did is it gave you a way to develop applications using a data. And so it was as much a programming language as a database, and they were merged. It was very hard for me to sort that out. So this is the way I ended up thinking about it.
That's very accurate. Very good explanation. Our focus was on making it easier to build those business applications, because I'd done that kind of work starting in the 60s for our uncle, into the 70s on mini computers and various operating systems and various programming languages, BASIC, COBOL, all this kind of stuff. And I felt, boy, this is really primitive. I mean, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I hooked up with some people. We started this company, Progress Software, now known as Progress Software, and created both the language and the underlying database to hold the information, which we thought was the right way to do it. Partially correct, partially wrong.
Wait, how did
things changed over time? So, but at the time it was correct.
How did it get it wrong? How was it wrong?
The database end turned into a much bigger business. Witness Oracle, who eventually bought or other companies bought most of our competitors, were kind of or Progress is kind of the only sort of database company that's still independent. And hasn't been either gone out of business or been bought by someone else. And they do a lot of other things now.
Yeah, but the database and
making it easier to build applications.
The database and the application development systems basically separated. So the database kind of grew once, and then it had standard APIs that people would use to access the data. So that they separated into two different businesses, and Progress did both.
Okay, very interesting. So, so we've got this application layer for the database, and it's funny because now, I entered this whole world. It was really funny thinking about reading the Steve Jobs biography and thinking about the personal computer. And the only interest I had in the personal computer as I was growing up was how it can help me to play the video games that I like playing. And Apple was horrible at this, and maybe you guys can give me more insight into why Apple was so horrible at it. But I was only on a Windows PC because Windows could only was the only OS that allowed me to play video games. I mean, this could be a side question, but where we could go into it. But why? Like, it's so interesting how it ended, because there's this big hole in my understanding of what happened in the 1980s and the 1990s. I know what happened in the 2000s. And so could you guys talk about more about now moving from databases and PCs into this 1990s? What happened in the 1990s?
Yeah, well, let's say so. The internet was introduced in the 1990s, basically kind of around 94, and it became commercialized.
The year of the internet was 94. Yes,
94.
Even though the internet had existed for 15 years prior, that's when it suddenly became viable as a way to connect computers and people
with standard security and access protocols. And so I started investing in 1996, and the reason I was allowed to become a venture capitalist, thanks in part to Joe's introduction to New Enterprise Associates, is that they looked at me and went, well, he knows about this new stuff like the PC and networking and all that, and so we better bring him in. Plus, he knows how to be public. So that was the swing time. The internet did exist previously as a sort of proprietary network between universities, and it was considered a not-for-profit public access kind of thing. And but the public couldn't access it because it was too difficult. So then there's this like transition, and it was really interesting to see how it happened, because there were a lot of people that felt that if the public was messing around with the internet, it would screw it up. And so they tried to defend it and keep it from the public. But it was the internet that happened, and the internet changed everything because it connected all the computers together. And previously all the networking had been done inside a particular company based on whatever equipment they had and what kind of programmers they had, technical staff. And so it was all done inside of a company. So there was a standard for hooking computers together called Ethernet that had already emerged, but there was no way to connect outside the companies or to connect the companies together, or to indeed as a personal computer user to get access to anything. So everything happened on the computer, whether it was a big one or a little one. And so the internet changed the fundamental paradigm and made everything possible to connect. It took 10, 15 years for actually all that stuff to happen and to have a truly broadband network that was high speed and allows to do things like this, for us to be on this Zoom call together in 3 different locations, you in a foreign country and Joe on the other side of the country from me, and actually have it work. It's pretty amazing. I'll even mention a little sidelight here, which is I'm on Comcast, but my backup network is Starlink, and they both work equally well. I could be on Starlink with Comcast as a backup. I'm a little more advanced than most remote properties.
Yes, I would think so.
So
Yeah.
so inside
And to what Stuart said, I think there were like 3 or 4 different things going on that coalesced to create what we know as the internet. I often argue that the fact that communications got really fast and really cheap, thanks to fiber optics and electronic switching. But another key issue was the invention of the browser by Tim Berners-Lee at the research center in Switzerland. I forgot the name.
Yeah, CERN, CERN. I remember what it stands for.
And he created the first browsers just as a way to make it possible for people to access those academic articles that were on the internet back then. And then that really exploded because people said, hey, this is an easy way to access the internet, to access stuff, material, information, documents on the internet. And so it was a whole bunch of things that coalesced. The deregulation of the telecoms industry in 1984 was a factor, because otherwise the whole thing would be controlled by AT&T and God knows where we'd be. And so, there were a whole bunch of things, and they just kind of coalesced and became important in 1994, because there was one of Stuart's competitors was Esther Dyson, and the year before, no one had mentioned the internet. In 93 and in 94, that's all they talked at her conference. I don't know about your conference, Stuart.
Another element, I'll just throw this in there because I'm sure you'll find it interesting, is that the rules changed for venture capital at about the same time. And I can't remember exactly what year, but pension funds were allowed to begin investing in alternative assets, risky assets. And so it was a rules change for how pension funds are managed. And so they started investing, and the amount of capital approximately between 1985 and 1995 exploded. And now most pension funds put 10, 15% of their assets in these pension funds are huge. So along with the endowments of the universities and family offices and high net worth individuals, the amount of money expanded dramatically, and it helped that whole internet explosion happen between 95 and 2000.
All right, that's very interesting. So the browser was essentially, how did people connect to the internet before the browser?
They had a terminal. No, it's actually no, because I saw it. They had a terminal,
typing in a whole bunch of weird commands, trying to get things to move across the internet. I mean, it was
what kind of things?
Nothing like what we're used to now.
Yeah,
it's very hard to imagine. It's the way the IBM PC was before Windows became dominant. You had the DOS interface, and you'd have to type commands to open files or to move them from one place to another. And that was mimicked the way that the mainframe terminals worked.
So the browser essentially created the opportunity for like a standardized way for people to interact with the internet. And what is the relationship between the browser and the graphic user interface? The browser showed up after the GUI, right?
Browser is an application in the graphical user interface. The GUI is like people like to call it. I'll give you my anecdote. So I was at InfoWorld between 1991 and 1996, and kept hearing about this internet thing, and I'm looking at my computer and going, well, how do I get on the internet? I actually had to go to the IT department and get a browser on a floppy disk to install on the computer, because the very first thing you had to do was to use the command line interface to install the browser. And this was a mind blower. I couldn't figure out how to do that. So the guy came over, and with a floppy disk, and they were 5.25-inch floppy disks at the time, and stuck it in my computer and did some magical typing. And then I had a browser. And so I spent like 3 weeks, maybe 3 months, just browsing. Like, oh my God, look at all this stuff. That was how you got over that hump of getting the browser on your computer, was a real, until the computer people started installing them on the computer, so that when you bought it, you already had it.
So Joe, what was it? When did you first get on the internet? What was your first experience on the internet?
Well, we had it at Progress and got the domain name progress.com very early on, probably back in the 80s. But much as Stuart describes, it was primarily used by our IT department to, communicate with other technical people, IT people around the world, or download files or whatever by typing obscure commands. So the browser was really what changed it and made us think about, okay, what's going to be the implication for the business applications that we're interested in, as opposed to, for example, maintaining our IT department, maintaining the infrastructure of the IT department.
So do you remember when you first used a browser as
Probably, if you're addressing it to me, probably around 93 or 94.
yeah, somewhere in there?
It was all about the same, but it was really the IT people at Progress who had used it before then. But we very quickly realized, hey, this is going to have an impact, and this is
Yeah.
going to make it much easier to access, the business applications that we were interested in. So we developed a version of our product line where the user interface was accessible through a browser.
So the first browser was called Mosaic, and it was developed in part by Mark Andreessen, which is why he's such a very rich dude now. Not directly because of that, but because he was there so early and has a big brain.
So, so there's a couple different questions, because we can go into that, because what is the difference between Mosaic and Netscape? But I also want to understand, what is Unix and why is that important? And like, where does open source fit into that?
Yeah, okay. So I'll answer. That's really two separate questions.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So with respect to Unix, I'll tell you the following story, because we at Progress Software depended heavily on the growth of Unix to drive our business. So as I mentioned previously, there were these 5 mini computer companies back in the 70s. There were also IBM and the Seven Dwarfs, which were the other mainframe companies.
And the bunch.
Or the bunch: Burroughs, Univac, NCR, Control Data, Honeywell. So they went by various pejorative adjectives and acronyms. But so we had to decide, okay, we're gonna build something that's gonna make it easy to build and deploy, install, business applications. Well, gee, what operating system or what platform or what computer just should we build this for? And basically, the conclusion I came to was, gee, the mainframe world is kind of all tied up and is dominated by IBM. That sounds like a tough thing to do. The mini computer world, the 5 names I mentioned previously, kind of fragmented, hard to see building a big business. And then I ran into Unix in the basement of some lab at Harvard, and started thinking, well, is this really going to take off or not? But we bet on Unix, and the associated programming language, which is C at that time, as kind of, okay, we're going to build for this. We're going to hope this Unix thing's going to take off, because if it doesn't, we can't sell a lot of our product on top of it. And it did take off. It took off in several ways. Sun Microsystems exploited it very successfully as a basis for building workstations. So it's more scientific engineering oriented, individual workstations for building certain types of applications, and actually defeated Apollo, which was the first company in that space.
Huh.
So again, the West Coast beat the East Coast. Sun Microsystems was on the West Coast, Apollo was on the East Coast. And then eventually, later on in the 80s, Unix became sort of the standard operating system for anyone building a new kind of mini computer operating system. Now, eventually, that morphed into Linux, which is like an open source version of Unix, but it's basically the same underneath, which then now has become very popular as an as a server-side operating system inside data centers.
Interesting. Okay, so you had Unix, which is this sort of fundamental thing for the mini computers, and then the mini computers transitioned into the PC industry, the
workstation industry, actually.
The workstation industry.
Yeah, there was a different industry, workstation. So the people at Sun Microsystems and Silicon Graphics, really, they looked at personal computers as like toys. And they had that attitude much more than actually the mainframe people did, because the mainframe mini computer people saw them as good terminals, intelligent local terminals. But the workstation people were like, no, we have these big, big screens and big computers, and they're much more powerful. So they're the ones that really enabled Unix. The PC has never really used Unix, although there are versions of Unix for personal computers. And as Joe refers, Unix is actually the underlying operating system for Macintosh. But that's a whole nother story.
Well, that's true too, yeah. Yeah, to go back further, Unix was originally created at Bell Labs, the AT&T research arm, in the 60s or 70s, as kind of, it was open source. You could buy a copy of it for, the cost of a reel of tape from AT&T. And it just turned out, well, that was a useful thing. If you were building new hardware and didn't want to reinvent an operating system, hey, start with this thing, because it's free and it's from AT&T, and I've forgotten the names of the developers, but there were two well-known people who actually created both the Unix operating system and the C programming language.
So interesting, because it's me and so many people my age and younger have no idea, unless there happen to be IT people who study the history of this stuff, have no idea all the things. Like I've got two computer screens in front of me. I got my phone, and like how these things operate in the back end is totally mystical to a lot of us. And go for it. Yeah. And
it's getting more and more mystical for those of us who know, actually, because these server farms, there's a huge amount of chips, and like, I have a fundamental question, maybe Joe can answer it. These LLMs require these NVIDIA GPUs, graphic processing units, which were originally developed for video games. And I can't figure out why the GPU is particularly useful for doing LLMs, because graphics processing and data processing are supposed to be two different things. And I can't wrap my head around why NVIDIA is worth $3 trillion now. Got an answer to that, Joe?
No, I really don't. I mean, I have some sense that the difference between let's call it CPU-oriented computing and the graphics processors is that they can do a lot more things in parallel, a lot more fairly simple things.
Yeah, simpler things, but really fast and a huge volume. That's what I know, but I can't figure out why an LLM is like putting graphics on the screen. It's like, can't wrap my head around it. So just so you know, Stuart, we're mystified too.
Yeah.
Even though we've been around a long time.
Well, And this is the whole idea of the singularity kind of thing in the age of acceleration. And it's funny you bring up LLMs because there's a new group of people called the Accelerationists, who are opposed to the Doomers. Doomers want to shut it all down. The Accelerationists want to not have any sort of regulation. Yeah. And it's just like, and so the Accelerationists are really interesting, because they're sort of utopian, whereas the degrowthers and the Doomers are very dystopian. And so there's something about brute force, and this is the opposite of the whole history of the entire personal computing industry, because it used to be all about efficiency, right? Like that you want to make your machines as efficient as possible. So you're kind of shaking your head, as opposed to this current generation, which is just throw tons and tons of compute. How is that wrong, or how is that right?
So the underlying shifts are, it goes back and forth between centralizing and distributing computing. A mainframe is centralized, right? You have terminals, they're dumb terminals. You can see what's going on inside the computer if you know how to issue the commands. The personal computer said, oh, it's all right here in the computer, and you don't have to worry about all the rest of it. Like, so it's not efficiency, actually. Power was the issue, how fast the CPU would go and how much memory you had, and other processing issues. And then you started hooking the personal computers together, and so it moved back to being centralized. And that's actually where we are right now. It's, these huge server farms sort of centralize all the compute power, which you can get to because we have these very high-speed networks. And then there's this thing about balancing between the edge and the core. So you have power processing going on in both places, and it's cooperative. Anyway, so that's the sort of fundamental shift that keeps going back and forth in the computer industry. Is like, where is the computing being done, and what's the capacity for doing the processing that's needed? That's a very high level view, but
yeah. Well, what's your take, Joe?
So the way I think about this is that computers used to be really expensive. So you carefully optimize the computer time. So you ran the computer 24 hours a day. People were relatively cheap. So you didn't optimize the people. You made them work day and night. You optimized the use of this computer because that was so bloody expensive. I mean, what's happened is compute has gotten very cheap. Communications has gotten very cheap, right? For the reasons I mentioned earlier. And the underlying reasons have more to do with things like fiber optics and electronic switching than they do with the internet, but the internet then could grow on top of that. And people have gotten a lot more expensive.
Yeah, interesting.
So, and the problem of managing all this software and kind of keeping it all running has gotten to be a really big problem. Some of the early attempts, which came under this buzzword of client server, really created more problems than they solved, because you ended up with this network of computers and trying to keep all these computers in all these different places on people's desks up to date. And then what if someone switched theirs off for the night? And it was an interesting period through the 90s, because of this thing called client server, which really was kind of a dead end for the industry. But the industry has lots of dead ends, and then eventually figures out the right way to do things, as we've seen over and over again.
So one of the interesting moments for me was when Gilman, my partner, walked into one of our partners meetings, and he'd been to some high level meeting and, big thinking, and don't remember who it was. And he said, the real issue going forward here is going to be energy. You're like, what are you talking about? And he says, well, these gigantic server farms consume enormous amounts of energy. So the people that were building the server farms started locating them next to rivers where they could use hydropower to
or in Norway,
or in Norway, or out in the ocean, wherever, anywhere they could get cheap power. And this is actually now cranked up through the crypto boom, and now with the LLMs, because that's only been a straight line. They just get more and more expensive to run these server farms. And it's because the processors consume a lot of energy. And so that's now a binding issue. That's what's keeping people back. is the amount of power they can put in one place.
When does that, I mean, why isn't China putting nuclear power energy data centers? Why isn't anybody running these with nuclear power?
Well, nuclear is a whole nother issue.
Yeah.
It makes total sense that nuclear would be a clean way to increase the amount of power we have, but people are really just weirded out by Chernobyl and the thing in Japan.
But that's why I mentioned China, because China, like, I don't think they have the same scruples as it comes to the political situation about nuclear power. But
Right.
That's hard to say.
yeah.
I mean, maybe Xi Jinping doesn't like the idea, and then it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay, so we got about 20 minutes left there. Okay, so we talked about Unix, we talked about the shift. I really like this decentralization to centralization, and then people are becoming much more expensive. But now we've got a new thing, and this actually is a great segue into AI and how it's all changing. Because now with AI, there are these things called autonomous agents, and they're very hyped. But the basic idea of an autonomous agent is that an LLM is given autonomy in some way that I don't understand still, and is allowed to go onto the internet and do various tasks with a loose goal. And so I haven't seen any of these, but I've done a few interviews. One particular use case for this is the agents aren't really good at open-ended tasks, but they're really good at back-end engineering, migrating code bases from one language to another. And so then you have this sort of new thing, which is that the computers themselves used to be expensive, then they got cheap. Now computers can do knowledge work, very expensive, but being subsidized by a bunch of VCs who have gone into OpenAI and essentially put a whole bunch of money into it to make it cheaper for the consumer. And now maybe in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll have agents who can go and complete tasks that normally a human would be the absolute like required thing for a human to do that. And now robots may be able to do this. So like, where are we headed now after you guys have seen the whole evolution? Where are we headed now with AI?
I can take it. Go for it, Joe.
So my overall sense and concern is that will lead to a hollowing out of the middle of society. So, we'll have people and who do fairly manual labor and so on. And yes, that may eventually get automated, but AI is focused more on the middle, and we'll need fewer and fewer, administrative people, middle managers, that kind of thing. And then there'll be presumably and even, legal, low-level legal people will maybe no longer have jobs. So we'll end up with these two extremes in society, and that does concern me. Where do most people, the traditional middle class, fit into this picture?
So I have a slightly different take on it. I understand what you're talking about, Joe, and I think that's a valid thing to be concerned about. But all the type I hear about agents and robots and all this stuff is, I still struggle to set the right time zone for a calendar item. And like, that seems like something that an agent should be able to figure out, right? It knows what airplane tickets I bought and where I'm going to be when I get there and what time zone I'll be in. And so why do I have to sit there and try to figure that out? So I'm an accelerationist at some level, based on what you said earlier, because I think inevitably human beings will figure out how to mitigate the social issues. It might take some time, like it did when we industrialized, and we had slave labor and all these kind of issues got worked out over time, and then you had a balance of power between management and labor and so on and so forth. That solved that problem. So each time we face one of these challenges, I have ultimate faith in the human race to not blow itself up and bring an end to the whole thing one way or the other, but to figure out how to package this and participate in it. So I am an optimist at heart, but until they can solve that time zone problem, and there's a bunch of others too, like even on the Mac, and I don't think you use a Mac. You do use a Mac, but you don't use an iPhone. On a Mac, the contacts and calendar programs that Apple makes put up the spinning beach ball and crash more often than any other application. And it's like provided by Apple. And I go, I have faith in Apple, but it's been like 20 years since they introduced these programs. Haven't they been able to figure out how to make them work? This is all kind of by the by. It's not really important and crucial, but I don't think AI is relevant until it can solve the really stupid problems that we all face.
Yeah.
That's
a great insight. Show me it can solve the stupid problems, then I'll start to have faith that it can solve the more sophisticated ones.
The significant ones, yeah, make life better.
Well,
I still have as a reference point in my head the robot movie that
Will Smith.
DALL-E the robot. The very
DALL-E.
first scene in that is just a stark dystopian view, because in that movie, in the beginning, there are these really fat people sitting in pods that are moving them around, and they're watching TV and the food's being stuffed in them. God, I hope we don't go there.
Okay, let's talk about that, because that's a really interesting point. Because I grew up with this idea that 1990s were the high point, and then it just kept on getting better and better. And then it was really Peter Thiel and his group of people who started to say, well, in the 1960s we had the Jetsons. We had this idea of the Jetsons.
I'll give you an anecdote on Ezra Klein. I think I sent this to you, but Ezra Klein did this. He's a columnist for the New York Times, but he does a podcast. They're just incredibly interesting. He's very curious intellect. And he started out this podcast, I think I sent it to you, that said, well, in 2024, if I do the math correctly, George Jetson should be 2 years old. You look at the Jetsons back in the 60s as a vision of the future. And then you go, it should be happening right now, and we're nowhere near that.
Yeah, exactly the point. And so for both of you growing up, as the 60s came about and we got to the moon and all of these really, airplanes took over our country, we were able to fly, both of you guys had experience of being able to fly transcontinentally and then internationally as well. And the whole world changed so significantly in the 1950s and the 1960s. And then it kind of just stopped. Except for the personal computing industry, which both of you were also interested in. And so do you guys feel like we've continued in the 1970s and 1980s? Do you think that's an accurate view of history? And are we headed back into it, or?
Well, certainly mobile telephones were a big thing that really didn't happen until the 90s. I do think that we need to focus more on tougher problems that are just not going to be susceptible to quick solutions, not going to be as good for venture capital investing. Sort of, whether it's energy or environment or any of these problems, it's hard for me to see how the combination of venture capital and individual initiative and an open society is really going to solve those problems. It seems to me the big problems that we face going forward are going to be kind of all of society problems.
What about you?
So I am an accelerationist. I'm an optimist. So I am believing that things will be better in the future. And I think they are better now than they were 10 years ago in some ways. But I also believe that for good things to happen, really bad things have to happen first. Because it's only out of really bad things that people get motivated to kind of collaborate with each other and make stuff happen. So World War II, the atomic bomb, these things that have happened in the past, something really bad, bubonic plague going all the way back. When people's lives are threatened, they take this stuff much more seriously. And to be honest, we're fat and happy here. And one of the biggest issues for the US is we are fat and happy. We're an incredibly wealthy society historically. If you go back till when mankind started, this is the most amazing society we have. And one of the reasons we have such a problem at the border is that everybody knows that and they want to come here. the polarization, the sort of political separation, and all this stuff that's been happening because of social media, or however you want to characterize it, I think is going to get worse until we take it seriously. And a lot will happen in November if it's Biden versus Trump. If Trump happens, I think it's going to be the kind of thing that's going to wake us all up and go, oh my God, we better deal with this, rather than thinking, oh yeah, he's kind of entertaining and whatever. So that's the point of view I have, is the pendulum swinger, right? The things go from one to another, and until they get really serious, good stuff doesn't really happen. So I feel like we're in the tail end of a process where it started really good after World War II, and we had this economic boom that really lasted for pretty much almost 40 years. Now we're kind of in this mixed bag, and technology has changed everything, and we don't trust anybody, and we're doubtful and tense. And so I think something's about to happen to change that.
Okay, that's really interesting. Joe mentioned a point that I want to burrow into, which is that it seems like from this whole discussion that venture capital used to be this thing that essentially took on really big projects. And then because now it seems like for the past 10 years, it's been like really, really, really risk adverse, even though the cost of money was really low. And that they haven't really gone after these hard problems that venture capital, in my mind, used to go after. Is that true? Or what has historically been the point of venture capital? Because when you're talking about these personal computing, and I'm reading Steve Jobs' biography, that took a lot of money to go set up those factories. It feel like a whole lot of investment. Was that accurate?
No, I totally don't believe that. So, and Joe may or may not agree with us, but venture capital started out very small, right? If you go back to Apple, I mean, the original financing of Apple was like $3 million. And or maybe a little more. I can't remember exactly what it was, but the venture capital funds themselves were like $3-5 million venture capital funds. This is in the late 70s and in the 80s. So what you see today is a completely different system with these multi-billion-dollar funds, which really aren't like that. It's not the amount of money in venture capital that matters. It's the sort of balance between the motivation to do something important and enough capital to make that happen.
Yeah, interesting.
What Joe's referring to is like Biden's doing at the infrastructure bill. I mean, the amount of money we're spending to set up an electric charger system and to incentivize people to buy electric vehicles over gas guzzlers and all that stuff. That's what governments do. And that's not a venture capital thing, as John Doerr proved conclusively at Kleiner Perkins when he set up a climate change fund and lost all the money. It was like,
yeah, it's been very tough to figure out how to apply the venture model to these big problems. And I commend Doerr for doing what he did, but it didn't.
There's still now climate change funds. People focused on that or infrastructure. So you mentioned Peter Thiel. One of the things his fund, Founders Fund, is doing is investing in like defense and space and things that are hard to do. We did a little of that too. It just takes a lot longer to make money in those domains. So.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I think the key phrase is what Stuart just says. It takes a lot longer to make money, and that's kind of at odds with the kind of ROI and IRR that venture is typically looking for, and Wall Street's typically looking for.
Okay, well, that's
so actually the thing I'd throw in there, Stuart, because you said your experiences with kind of the last 12 years, say 2012 on, that period of very low interest rates actually made it much easier to do big venture capital funds because and it combined with social media, because the cycle time for investing in something, the money came back really fast, and so that got everybody very excited, and so they raised a lot of money to invest in venture capital. The fact that interest rates are back up now makes it way harder, and people forgot the role that interest rates play or that debt plays in the economy, and they're beginning to relearn it now.
So why is the 10-year, this will be the last question, why is the 10-year cycle so important for getting the money back from an institutional investor? Why does an institutional investor look to get their VC money back within 10 years, the money that they give to a VC?
Because whatever return in terms of multiple that you're going to achieve the faster you get it back, the higher the internal rate of return. That's the way ultimately all investments are measured. You know, to quote Warren Buffett, investing is laying out money today to get more money tomorrow. And the larger the multiple and the sooner it comes back, the higher the IRR. And, you know, my observation during the late 90s was, particularly with the explosion in the telecom area, driven by the internet, because, you know, these bits had to move over something, was that VCs could invest large amounts of money and rapidly get back a big multiple of their money, rapidly, quickly. And that produces very large IRRs.
Yeah.
Then it slowed down, then it speeded up again. But in most cases, in my view, it's hard. The things that society needs, which are big investments, like Stuart's mention of the infrastructure bill, that, you know, may not pay out in financial terms, except possibly over the long term, if ever. That's not.
So,
Yeah, that's not well rewarded by the financial system.
My life as a venture capitalist is ruled by the corollary to what Joe's saying, which is that time is the enemy of return. And the longer it takes, less interested people are investing in alternative assets, risky stuff. If they get it back fast, they're really into risky investments, which is what happened. And as I said, in the social media business, like Instagram got bought before it even had revenue for like $1 billion or whatever it was. Those kind of investments, Facebook, Snapchat, and all those things turn their investments over really quickly because it was just software and it was scaling on the internet. So that was a anomalous time. That was not the norm. And the norm is there's always this tension between how long it takes you to make money and how much risk you take. And so if you're getting,
and how big the return is at the end.
So if you're getting like 5% interest on something, that enters into the calculation of how much risk you take. If it's like absolutely safe to get 5%, then you have to have something that really returns a lot to exceed the stability of that return. And so China is a really interesting case because Xi Jinping's been running that country for 20 years, and he made decisions that turned out to be brilliant in their infrastructure. I mean, the dam on the Yangtze and all the stuff they put up around Shanghai and Beijing in terms of round routes and subways and all that kind of stuff, you know, allowed everybody to move into the big cities, and they built up their industries. So it looks brilliant right now. My corollary to, you know, bad things have to happen to have good things happen. If good things happen, something bad's about to happen too. So I think China's,
or may already be happening in the case of China.
They're probably already happening. We just haven't seen it yet. But so China's not as strong as it looks like. Russia's like pillaring itself on the Ukraine. You know, Israel is the goddamn bully of Mideast. I mean, whoever thought Israel would be a bully? And unless you have Netanyahu running the place. So it's like all these things that are going on, everything changes over time. So that was a bit of a rant, but
It's beautiful.
That's a good rant.
Yeah.
That was a good rant. Yeah.
Well, we'll do another rant, an hour-long rant soon. But thank you so much, Joe, for coming on the show. And thank you, Dad.
My pleasure.
Yeah. And here's to many more.
Enjoyed it.